everyone. So this is AAA Live here at the Education Channel. This is your host, Attorney Amian April M. Alcazar, airing every Wednesdays from 8 to 9 p.m. On YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and all our social media platforms. You may like, subscribe, and follow us. And we hope that you will continue to tune in to all our programs on the Education Channel.
We'll move from the physiological effects of the COVID pandemic to now possibly the psychosocial effects of the pandemic. And specifically, I'd like to take a part of a study that I'm going to continue with respect to learning loss and specifically on the broader subject of education loss during the COVID pandemic. But I focus on like one segment of the study, which is about indigenous cultural communities of a particular area in the Philippines called Aeta. So these are some practices which were utilized to address learning loss among the Aeta indigenous school children due to the influx of pandemic. So before I go into the actual research, I'd just like to introduce this particular indigenous cultural community because it's actually a very fertile ground for future anthropological study. So the Aitas, it's pronounced as I, as in I, what we were speaking about earlier, Aitas are the earliest known inhabitants of the Philippines. So according to historians, the actual are actually Australo-Melanesian. So they probably come from the same group as those of Aborigines in Australia and Melanesia in Solomon Islands. But how did they actually come to the Philippines? So it's not really clear based on anthropological studies how they were able to cross over to the archipelago of the Philippine Islands. But one theory is the Bering Island theory is a possible explanation for their presence in the Philippines. So according to this theory, there were land masses or narrow straits that connected previously during the Ice Age all the land masses in the world. And then these hunters, their forefathers, crossed the land bridges, but due to the movement of the tectonic plates, these migration paths eventually disappeared. So with the disappearance of the pathway, so they were unable to return to their original habitation. They're very different from the other indigenous communities that we have in the Philippines. Sorry. Okay, I have to move it. So they're actually characterized by the features of their skin color, height, and their hair. So they are mostly with their hair dark and dark to dark brown skin, curly hair, and are usually below 5 foot tall. So they traditionally were nomadic, hunting and gathering people, and they also exhibited skills in the use of medicinal plants for health and healing, just like other indigenous communities, and possessed tools and weapons to be used for a nomadic life, building temporary shelters made of sticks and gathering firewood for cooking. Now, in this next depiction, it came from the Spanish colonial period that they were designated as Negritos, which is actually like small Negroes or Africans, but it was a misnomer on the part of the Spaniards just because of their physical appearance. Now, insofar as their belief system were concerned, so they practiced monotheism, but they were also animists. So they believed in a supreme being, but at the same time, they also believed in environmental spirits. So they believed that various places in the environment are governed by both good and evil spirits. So they also possessed the skills in weaving and plating, and then so their attires are very similar to what is shown in the picture. So the women would have skirts or bark cloth for women and loincloths for men, but they also had developed arts with the use of ornaments as accessories and of course music with ensembles of instruments created for making melodies and rhythms. So they have a very natural affinity to rhythms and to music. Now, based on our geography, so we are an archipelago, but they are found in the northern part of Luzon, which is also the place where there are several other indigenous cultural communities. You might have heard about the, well, probably more infamous of them, the so-called headhunters, the Ifugaos, and those that actually carved out the rice terraces out of the mountains, the Igorots. But they actually habitated the area near a dormant volcano before called Mount Pinatubo, which is in the intersection of the provinces of Pampanga, Zambales, and Tarlac in the central island of Luzon, where Manila, the capital, is located for thousands of years. Because these were all mountainous areas, so we were like talking about post-colonial or decolonized. So actually, the Spanish colonizers had a hard time introducing Catholicism to them because they were hard to reach geographically. So the Aetas actually mostly resistant change, which made it difficult actually for the Spaniards to gain inroads in the northern part of the Philippines. So possibly this is one explanation why they were able to maintain their cultures and traditions until fairly recently, like until the 20th century. Now, just to give you a little bit of the segment of this particular research, so the broader research is really about early childhood development for school children's milestones of development up until the age of 0 to 7. And the effect of the COVID pandemic is that many children of this age group has not yet been able to actually experience studying in a school environment. Why? Because in the Philippines, it has been almost, or it's already been 2 school years where students have not been able to have face-to-face conduct of classes or in-person instruction. So the comparative study is between students who had previously experienced a school environment versus children who have not experienced at all the school environment. And of course, a subset of this study will be a comparison between the experience of indigenous cultural communities who actually don't have access to digital education or modern technology for the delivery of education vis-a-vis children who actually utilize virtual tools to access education. Of course, both have psychosocial effects on their milestones of development in early childhood. So basically, so this subset of the study would focus on the ITA school children and the learning loss that they experienced due to COVID. And one of the effects here, actually for the ITAs, is that in the area where they had the volcano in 1991 when it erupted. So this was a very large disaster in the Philippines, comparable to what we were discussing yesterday from Haiyan. This was the Mount Pinatubo eruption of July 1991. So a majority of the Aeta population were decimated during that time. And of course, literally the landscape was changed in the sense that topographically, this became filled with lahar or lava-filled land, and at the same time, they had to relocate and be resettled. So actually, that was more or less the time around 30 years ago when they became more modernly influenced by mainstream Filipino culture and practices, including going to school. So it's fairly recent when they really had access now to the education, the mainstream educational system. So the sample population here, actually, school children located in Pampanga, one of the provinces where the indigenous culture communities are located or have been relocated, and specifically for grade 2 students because they fall within the profile of the sample population, which is early childhood. So this descriptive study for now explored the ways within which the students experience education loss in a general sense and how mitigating measures were undertaken by the stakeholders, namely student, teachers, parents, and administrators of the school to address their concerns. Now, of course, once we are able to actually return to face-to-face instruction and or kind of hybrid delivery for education, then that is going to be another segment of the study on how to compare possibly the effects on psychosocial skills development of the school children once they would have the demands of a social environment for the educational system that they would have to undergo in comparison to how they were able to manage it during the COVID pandemic, which is more of a homeschool environment. So here is the respondents to this particular segment of the study. So you have 44 total students enrolled in grade 2, 25 girls and 19 boys. So this total of this particular elementary school for this cohort. And this is very interesting data that I wanted to emphasize because this is one particular characteristic of the indigenous community in that there is a wide variance of ages that actually continue studying even though they are not chronologically belonging to that particular cohort. So later I'll explain a little bit why that is the case. So in this particular case, most children will begin school when they are 6 years old. This is already the mandatory mandated K-12 system with kindergarten. And then followed by the first grade. And then, so now we're talking about the second grade. So here we're talking about 10 girls and 10 boys. Similarly, they are within the age group of 7 of the 44. Then you move to age 8 and you have 6 girls and 2 boys, 8 in total. Then you have 4 girls and 4 boys who are age 9. You have age 10 for 3 girls and 2 boys. You have 1 girl who's age 11, and finally you have 1 boy who's age 12. So there's a varying levels of age here, age group from 7 to 12 belonging to the same cohort. So you might be wondering why. So there are 2 particular reasons for this. One is that in the public educational system in the Philippines, there's an open admission policy in that students have this intake regardless of their chronological age, as long as they sign up to what they have been progressively following. So that's why those who were like late in coming to school, meaning they did not begin at age 6, can still be an intake because they would have to progressively follow the structure of elementary education or even secondary education. Then the other reason for that is belonging to an indigenous cultural community. Of course, they are bound by certain tradition, practices, or even their familiar circumstances that might prevent them from actually beginning school at the age of 6, and therefore they would belatedly join the educational system. So that's why there's a variance here with respect to the ages. And so if we look at the traditional concept of early childhood development, we know for a fact already, given this statistics from the profile of the respondents, that there is already indeed a cumulative deficiency insofar as early childhood development is concerned, because they have actually been late in going into like the formal educational system. There's still another one, sorry. Another statistic was 1 girl is age 14. So that's very large. From age 7 to age 14, you're already in adolescence when you're 14 years old. So that's kind of a little bit skewed, but we stick to like what the concepts would be in terms of early childhood development. And so there is going to be some skewness insofar as the analysis later on because of the level of chronological age variance between the respondents. Now, before the COVID pandemic, as I mentioned, they had in-class instruction. But even at the time, so we're already saying that there's already marginalization insofar as access to education is concerned by the indigenous community. So the absentee rate or even the dropout rate. So when we talk about absentee rates, they pertain to learning loss because they are in the educational system. But if we talk about education loss, generally it's when you have the dropout rates. So people are not able to continue or to access education. So they generally already missed school. Either they were late in starting school, or even if they joined the formal educational system, they often miss school days to help with the families with their chores or livelihood or take care of their younger children. So that's part of the reason why I was saying there was so much variance insofar as the age group of the students were concerned, even though they are actually in primary grades. So primary grades would cover from kindergarten to the 3rd grade. Now, of course, the Aeta parents, as I've explained earlier, so they were late in coming into the mainstream educational system after they were resettled from the Mount Pinatubo volcanic eruption. Of course, they are as concerned with the value of quality education, on how to access education and then to continue. And of course, the parents wanted to have some interventions in order to maintain the interest of the students in education and, of course, to address learning loss. Now, from an educator's perspective, like myself, who have been working with indigenous communities, but of course, with the prototype of the mainstream educational system, sometimes the dilemma here is whether there's actually an imposition of cultural imperialism on the indigenous communities because you're introducing an alien form of learning to them. But maybe one way to reconcile that as a justification is knowing that the indigenous communities are already coming from a position of being a marginalized sector of society. And without the access to education, they become further marginalized, disadvantaged, or even oppressed because they are not able to access the benefits of what the mainstream society is able to offer. So, so therefore, here, as I was saying, there has been no in-school instruction at Monicay Elementary School since the COVID pandemic, basically in the Philippines since March 2022 until the current time. And the biggest challenge actually to reach the Aeta school children who had the limitations, in this case, no electricity in their homes, no devices, no computer knowledge or training, and limited help from parents. So eventually, actually, majority of what was adopted by the Department of Education in the Philippines, not only for the indigenous communities, but for a majority of mainstream school children who were difficult to reach remotely or were dispersed throughout the Philippine archipelago, was to actually print modules, have it physically distributed and delivered to the villages, and have it collected again in order for evaluation and assessment to be done by the school teachers. So because of this, of course, in the circumstance of the Aeta community, many of the parents had no formal education. In fact, a very low level of literacy that we've found, of course, in many indigenous communities. So they are often challenged really to assist their children in doing their assignments or tasks in school. And then, of course, the teachers noted that module assignments of different students, whether they were belonging to the same family or they were neighbors, were sometimes done by one person, or one person actually only helped multiple children who were studying different subjects. So in order to address the concern of learning loss, at least for those able to maintain their education, even though there were no in-class instructions, so several interventions were actually done and practiced by the teachers in this particular elementary school. So the first, and this is actually very difficult because it was actually to teach the parents of the school children so they could assist their children with their lessons. Actually, there's a joke in the Philippines now going around that parents have become module legends based on like that game, the computer game, because during the pandemic, they were actually the most challenged to help their school children keep up with the schoolwork. But again, as I said, due to the low level of literacy, out of the 44 parents, guardians of these students in this grade 2 class, only 8 parents were able to receive lessons from the teachers. So very, very low percentage. So the other way that they were able to reach out was to conduct a broadcast weekly lesson through radio frequency. As we already know, in indigenous community, learning is often through oral tradition. Like this is, the Aetas are one of the indigenous communities that had no syllabary. I had discussed previously the Mangyans, but they had the last remain, that they were the only ones who had this like written syllabary. So where local businesses were solicited so that they could contribute 200 portable radios to families with students so that students can complement and follow their printed modules with the radio broadcast, because that was like one advantage always of the teachers, is that they were in class instruction, they were able to allow the students to follow what was in the printed word with what they were actually instructing in the classroom. So this is a simulation or a substitute for what they have done in the classroom previously. Then, in the case of those students whose parents were not able to receive instructions from the teachers, some limited face-to-face instruction days or so-called tutorials were offered to the students. And then, as you can see, of course, some support was solicited for them also for backpacks, so for the school children who attended the instruction days. Then there was also access to the police force, because they were, of course, very active during the COVID pandemic, to keep the safety and security of communities, for them to participate in the reading program, both in the school during those limited instruction days, and also going house to house, because during the quarantine or lockdown in the Philippines, especially from March until May of 2020, movement was very much restricted, especially among school children, or yeah, basically there was only one person in the household who was allowed to go out to do the food shopping, and all others needed to stay indoors. And after that severe restriction, school children were actually virtually not allowed to leave their homes, basically in the Philippines. Um, so with these practices, of course, at the moment, it's not yet quantifiable insofar as we still need to actually compare the data as to what would be the milestones of development that have actually regressed. That is the hypothesis during this period of the COVID pandemic, and despite interventions, on how far in terms of like variance from the milestones of development they are from early childhood development. So of course, the objective is to greatly improve the traditional pedagogy for distance learning. If some of you are, well, in that period of time when we had distance learning, we experienced like mailing assignments and physically having to write our homework so that the professors could actually correct or do the assessment or evaluation of our schoolwork. So it's kind of similar to that, in the sense that they would have like the printed modules, they would have like the exercise books, and then they would be collected by, let's say, the barangay or officials, and then they would be returned eventually to the teachers for their assessments. So I think for now, this particular study is such that there could be a comparative study about learning loss for those who experience homeschooling during the COVID pandemic, vis-a-vis what may potentially happen when face instruction can be compared to that. So if you have any questions, so I'll be happy to answer.